Well, Dr. Ritchie, I'm just going to start with a real simple question. Is maybe you could tell us a little bit about the history of the Unitarian Universalist, some of its roots, how it came into fruition, and we'll just start right there.
Okay, but let me just say I'm thrilled to be here and meet you all. Thanks for having me. So, the first thing I like to say about Unitarian Universalist history is that our first congregations were formed in 1568. So, it was an early part of the Protestant Reformation. I like to say that because I think for folks who don't know a lot about us, they think that we probably came to being in 1968, but it's much older than that. So it was in Eastern Europe that you start to see the first congregations that call themselves Unitarian. So if you can kind of imagine the time, this is the second generation of the Protestant Reformation. And what you're seeing is denominations emerging one after another, right? So the Reformation begins with Lutheranism, but then, Protestantism is this amazing thing that whatever about it, it has this capacity to kind of splinter within itself, right? I mean, I know we don't have yellow pages anymore, but when we did, if you look up churches, Protestant churches in the yellow pages, you'll get 200 varieties, and you kind of need to be an expert to know the difference between all of them, right? So I'm sharing that because part of our journey was those first congregations to call themselves Unitarian were kind of regretting that Protestantism was splintering into smaller and smaller groups, small groups that demanded that everyone believe completely the same, right? If you have a difference of opinion about a communion, you wouldn't stay in the same group, you would form another group. And so our folks were those who were thinking perhaps Christian unity would be a better idea than this endless division, but really their core belief and their core value was thinking that diversity of belief is a good thing. And a piece of that was a commitment to theological humility, really, the belief that no single human or no single human institution really has the complete lock on the absolute truth. And if you believe that, then you need a diversity of opinions to kind of check your own and to really just get another view on ultimate reality. How many folks have heard the blind man and the elephant story? Yeah, okay, yeah, lots of people. This is so fun because I hear it sometimes attributed as a Buddhist story, sometimes attributed as a Hindu story, sometimes attributed as a Sufi Muslim stories. So if all those folks are trying to lay claim to it, you know it must be good. So I'll do my little bit to lay claim to it. But of course, the story goes that you've got some blind men who are trying to figure out what an elephant is, right? So they report back what they feel. So the guy who's standing by the ears of the elephant is like, elephants are really wide and flat. And the guy who's standing by the trunk is like, no, elephants are exactly like trees. And so each of these people is giving a different report of what the elephant is. And of course, the bottom line is not that any of them that were wrong. It's just that there's an encompassing reality larger than any one of them could see individually.
I love what you said about the theological humility and that the diversity comes from that idea. Unitarian Universalism is often called non or referred to as non-creedal or not having a creed. That the focus is not so much on what one believes, but on how one lives out their life. It's more an ethical society, or not an ethical society, an ethical driven religion. Forgive me for not explaining it properly. Maybe can you say something a little bit about that? Yeah, I think the volumes are kind of low today, so if you can just hold that close.
Sure, you got it. Is that better? Yeah. Yeah, we often call ourselves an orthopraxy instead of an orthodoxy. Orthodoxy, of course, being about correct belief, orthopraxy being about correct practice. But to get to what you're asking about, we often stress covenant versus creed because here's your dilemma, right? You want to form a church, or at least our spiritual ancestors did, that's committed to diversity of belief. So if it's not homogeneity of belief that's gluing your church together, what is holding your church together? So it was folks in our lineage who were sure that what holds the church together is covenant, are the promises that we make to one another, and however you understand it, the promise you make to your ultimate commitments and your ultimate concerns. So indeed, when Unitarianism emerges in America, it's as a splinter group within the Congregationalist Church, but the disagreement in the Congregationalist Church at that time was whether the glue of the church is creed or the glue of the church is covenant. And it was our folks who were thinking covenant was the most important piece of that.
That's it, the blues covenant. That's beautiful. Um, you know, I've met Unitarian Universalists, and I've attended services there, and it's interesting about diversity because sometimes I'll meet someone who'll say, I'm a Christian Universalist, or I'm a Buddhist Unitarian Universalist, or I'm an atheist or a humanist, or I'm a Jewish, And so, can you just explain a little bit about that? How people from coming from different religious and ethical traditions can gather together under a Unitarian Universalist umbrella?
Yeah, exactly. And that is a core commitment of ours is pluralism, right? So yes, we do have folks who we call them, hyphenated Unitarians, Jewish Unitarians, Buddhist. I'm kind of boring myself because I don't have a hyphen. I'm just a Unitarian Universalist. Actually third generation, which is kind of weird in our circles. But yeah, there's another joke that goes that, if you're going to belong to more than one religious tradition, one of them better be Unitarian Universalism, simply because our commitment to pluralism. But yeah, we have folks who either come from different traditions. For a long time, a path into our church was intermarriage. Folks, often Jewish Christian intermarriages, people wanting to have a place to bring their families where both sets of traditions would be valued. But we also have people who just find their spiritual direction taking different paths, and so they're exploring Buddhism, but doing it in the context of our congregations. Sometimes people related to that ask me, so what does membership in our congregation mean? If it's not exclusive, what does it mean? And we're very clear that it means that you found our congregation to be a place where you're currently exploring your spiritual journey. Chalice is our logo, so I often like to joke, if you become a member of our church, you don't have to put a tattoo of a chalice on your forehead, and you don't have to give us your firstborn children. You're saying this is the community that you're now doing your exploration in.
I want to ask a question about God, and so in the United States, my understanding is that the roots, the pre-Unitarian Universalist denomination, had Christian roots, maybe from different denominations, but at some point it moved from a traditional Christian Trinitarian perspective to a more Unitarian perspective. Can you talk a little bit about what is Trinity, as you understand it, what is Unitarianism, and what is God for the Unitarian Universalists, and how is God a Unitarian Universalist?
Nothing there. Just, okay, we've just got the Trinity and God and all this. Okay, great. We can do it. So to talk about like what is Unitarian versus Trinitarian, we can go back to the Protestant idea. So if you're a Protestant denomination, you've made a kind of statement that at some point the church took a direction that was a little unfortunate and needed to be remedied, right? So the first generation of Protestants were like, okay, everything was fine until the popes became corrupt, and that's the piece we have to correct. But other Protestantisms chose other dates. I mean, this is just like a computer problem, right? You know, if your computer goes berserk, you try to reset it to the time before it went bad, right? And Protestant denominations make different choices about that date. But classically, Unitarians have looked to 325, the Council of Nicaea, as the time where maybe some unfortunate things went down. So Council of Nicaea 325, first time in church history that the entire church met together to talk about issues of belief. And famously, there was a debate between two bishops, Arius and Athanasius. And what comes out of the council is the first creed, really, the idea, a very specific idea about what Christians were to believe about the nature of Jesus. And Athanasius had been the bishop arguing the point that was victorious at the council, and that was to say that Jesus was fully human and fully divine. Arius was the bishop arguing another point. He believed that Jesus was fully human and divine, but not divine in exactly the same way that God is, in the sense that he believed that Jesus at some point had been begotten, had been created in a way that God had not been created. This is 4th century theology. We don't need to get in the weeds with that. What makes this important to us is because of the commitment to diversity, we regretted that what came out of that council was the requirement that all Christian communities believe the identical thing about Jesus. And before that council, it was completely acceptable. Different Christian communities had different ideas about who Jesus was, and no one found that problematic. And it makes complete sense, right? Different communities told different stories about Jesus. And so anyway, it was our feeling that the church would have been richer if it had not made that choice for doctrine as opposed to diversity. But it gets tied up, because of those things happening all together, it gets tied up with this conversation about unity, the unity of Jesus versus a Trinitarian understanding of God. So that takes care of the Trinity part. Now we just got God.
Right.
Yeah, nothing hard about that.
There's nothing more practical than good theory, I had someone say to me. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think some people have the misconception that Unitarian Universalism has grown beyond a God concept. We really have not. Back to that concept of diversity, if you poll the members of my congregation, you would find folks who believe in a very traditionally Christian understanding of God. You would find atheists, and you would find an entire continuum of people in other places. Back to our Buddhists, back to our Jewish folks. We have some folks who identify as neo-pagan. So it would be hard to say more than a few things about what God is inside of Unitarianism, but we can say what's beyond the pale in terms of thinking about God inside of our tradition. So, for example, you would be hard-pressed to be a Unitarian Universalist and believe in a God that limits human will. Our history has always been a commitment to choice, human determination, and the idea that humans, gosh knows we don't always make the right choices, but that we have actually been gifted with some pretty amazing faculties for discerning truth and how to act upon it. So there's a huge continuum, but again, some kind of core commitments. And obviously, it would be hard to believe in an understanding of God that would be an exclusivist understanding, meaning, not making room for other understandings. But
Good, thank you. I'm sorry.
no, I was just kind of reading your reaction because I it's so awkward to talk about what things aren't, right? But that's the interesting challenge of being a big umbrella tradition is we're always trying to use language that's encompassing and not limiting, and that can be very challenging.
So you mentioned earlier the distinction between orthodoxy and orthopraxis, right? What we believe and how we live out that belief. But Unitarian Universalism does have a religious education, right? Kind of like a Sunday school religious education. What does that look like? What is taught, what is passed on to children, to adults? What does religious education in a UU setting look like?
It's a great question. And especially in America, Unitarians have made a lot of contributions, not just to religious education, but to education in general. For example, the reforms in education that happened in the 19th century had a lot to do with Unitarian thinking. And just to give you an example, the Unitarian educational philosophy goes back to our basically positive understanding of human nature. Again, not that we don't make mistakes, but that we have pretty amazing capacities. So it follows that our educational theory is about discovering what's best and good in children and really nurturing that rather than overly punishing children or only disciplining their negative aspects of their personality. So it became a very kind of liberal form of education. So in terms of what we do today in our Sunday schools, we'd like to encourage children on their spiritual journey. So I am amused sometimes that some Sunday schools imagine that children come to us without already having spiritual experience, right? And that the job is somehow to give them this thing they don't have. It would be our belief that children are already having spiritual experiences, and that the task then of the community and of the classroom is to help them understand them, give them a vocabulary, get them accustomed to talking about those experiences, and receiving some guidance again in terms of ethical and moral ways of acting those out. But we do reject the idea that we're there to fill something up.
My back training is in religious education, and one thing I admire of the Unitarian tradition is its diverse religious education, how children learn about Buddhism and Judaism and Islam and Christianity, and it really provides them a broad educational experience. And that's something I've always admired about the Unitarian tradition.
Yeah, I can tell you a funny story about that. I remember growing up, I went to Unitarian Universalist Sunday schools my whole childhood, and my favorite memory of Sunday school was there was this man in the congregation who was a physics professor at a local university, and we spent one whole Sunday lesson with him just showing us how to freeze bananas using liquid nitrogen. Now, on one hand, you could say, what's less religious than that, right? But my memories of this are just so sweet and dear. So, what did I take away from that? I took away the idea that the universe is an amazing place full of awe and wonder. And I took away the idea that this man who wasn't related to me, who had really cool things to say, was going to spend time with me and show me what he did. It was wonderful.
Um, of course, a major core value principle uh, for Unitarian Universalism is its emphasis and commitment to ethical living and to justice and social justice. And it's interesting, I know in recent times, there were a number, in recent times, meaning the last 2 weeks, there were a number of UU ministers who went to Minneapolis to speak out their truth. And I'm wondering if you can say something about the UU's commitment to justice, uh, ethical living and justice, because that's such a core part of the tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can tell you, I was one of the UU ministers who went to Minneapolis 2 weeks ago. This was in a response. There is a multi-faith group in Minneapolis that's very active, called March, multi-faith. Oh, you know how an acronyms are. I'm not going to get it all. But anyway, it's a multi-faith group representing a lot of different traditions that's been very active in Minneapolis. But they put out a call for clergy to go to Minneapolis and witness to what was happening there. Of course, this was happening over the Martin Luther King Day weekend, so it was deliberately meant to be reminiscent of when Martin Luther King asked for clergy to go to Selma during the fight for voter rights. So, yeah, justice is absolutely a core commitment. There were a lot of Unitarian ministers who responded to the call to Selma as well. And indeed, the first white person who was martyred in the civil rights movement was Reverend James Reed, who was one of those Unitarian ministers who responded to the call to go to Selma. Um, so there's so much about that that's kind of natural to who we are and what we do. Spoken a little bit about Unitarianism. Maybe now a word about Universalism will help demonstrate why justice is so key to us. So the Universalist side of our family believed in universal salvation. And what they meant by that was if God is loving, why would God arrange for punishment and pain for us? But a consequence of that belief ethically became the belief that if we are born equal, and if at death we are equal, why is there so much inequity in this life? And so it became a universalist conviction that the inequity in this life is human made. That's both good news and bad news. It's bad news because it shows the kind of darkest side of what human beings can do to each other, but it's good news because the belief was if it's human made, it can be human remedied. And so that commitment to equality is absolutely tied into our most core theological assumptions. But I can just add another aside, which is so much of the justice work is interfaith work. And of course, with our tendency to think that diversity of belief is good, we're pretty natural partners in interfaith efforts.
So that leads me to the next question about interfaith dialogue and ecumenical dialogue. What's the UU's approach to conversation with Christianity and with other world religions? That's a big question.
I got a big answer for you. The more, the better, right? I mean, I'm sure you're not surprised, even from the little we've already talked about, that if you believe in that diversity is important to enhance your own understanding, as many other human beings you can be talking to from whatever walk of life, the better. So we enter into those relationships with a great deal of curiosity. And of course, a peculiarity to us is that because we assume that the diversity of belief is good, we can enter into those conversations without anxiety about either being not true to our own faith or anxiety about a need to convert others to ours. So it's a very natural relationship for us. And indeed, a lot of the early conversations between world religions, like the World Parliament of Religions and those kind of efforts that started late 19th century, had Unitarians at the heart of them.
In a few minutes, we're going to open it up for questions, so just kind of keep that in mind. And you've touched on some of this, but what draws people to Unitarian Universalism today? Are there any stories, anything that you're hearing for people being drawn to Unitarian Universalism?
Yeah, that's a great question. Would think the main thing that we see in terms of come-inners, so folks who haven't been previously Unitarian Universalists, is a need to be seen in their beauty and their wholeness as they are. We don't require conversion, right? Because we have this very educational, developmental understanding about how people go through their spiritual lives, it's very easy for us to meet people where they are. And so, frankly, a lot of folks who are most comfortable with us are people who are coming out of traditions where maybe they didn't feel like the fit was so good, or maybe they felt like some aspect of their identity wasn't fully affirmed, and they've become a little bit church phobic. And we seem to be a good place to help deal with some of those issues.
What might be some misconceptions about Unitarian Universalism?
So many. You can believe anything you want to. That's when I hear a lot. And that's, coming from a kind of a very conventional assumption that it's impossible to have any boundaries to your belief if you're not adhering to a single doctrine. But we have boundaries to our belief. So just the fact that we are affirming of tolerance, that doesn't mean everything goes. That means your beliefs need to be affirming of tolerance, right? Which is not every single belief in the world.
Interesting. What do you hope people of other faith traditions understand or appreciate about Unitarian Universalism? What do you want them to understand? Is there anything in particular?
Well, I think this is related to what I just said about the misconception. I would love for folks to know how theologically serious we are. We're not being theologically promiscuous. We're not, I swear. We are absolutely committed and theologically clear.
Well, I'm going to grab a microphone there, and I'm going to just walk around just to take questions from anyone. I forgot to bring the microphone here as this one falls. Upward. Okay. Any questions?
So what is a service like? Do you meet more than once on Sunday or Monday, whenever you meet? Tell me more about that.
Thank you. So yeah, we do Sunday morning services, and actually the format of the services would look very familiar to anyone who's familiar with Protestant worship, right? So we have hymns, we have readings, we have a choir that does sacred music. Our people are very sermon obsessed. The sermon is usually the heart of the worship service. So the form of the worship would look very familiar to you. What would be a little different is the range of things from which we draw. So for readings, for example, sometimes we'll draw from scripture, sometimes we'll draw from scripture from other world traditions, or sometimes we'll draw from contemporary literature. My people have a great affection for poetry. So we're looking for insights from a broader range of materials than you might find in a typical Protestant service, but nothing that happens there would surprise you.
I find it interesting that there are two names that are spoken when talking about your tradition. Going way back in time, I remember Unitarian. When did the Universalist name come a part of it, or maybe my upbringing wasn't complete?
No, thank you. It's a great question because we've had a lot of conversations about our name because I'll just say it's awkward, right? I mean, it's too many syllables. I feel like my life would have been longer if I didn't have to answer the phone at my congregation, right? North Unitarian Universalist Congregation. And it's very confusing because it's named after two traditions, Unitarian, Universalist, using the names of doctrines when in fact we're non-creedal. So boing, it makes, there over the years there's actually been conversation about trying to change the name. For a while people were floating Liberal Church of America, which is kind of easier, but of course these names have historic resonances and it's not easy to change. But to answer your question, the Unitarians and the Universalists merged in 1961. Prior to that, they were separate, but fairly parallel liberal religious movements inside of America. But it was in 1961 that it was finally decided that there was enough similarity to justify a consolidation. But they did come from slightly different places. So as I said, the Unitarian Church was out of the Congregationalist Church here in America with that Puritan lineage. And then the Universalists were kind of grassroots movements throughout New England, different congregations coming to an understanding of universal salvation by themselves. But yeah, it wasn't until 1961 that we get Unitarian Universalism.
So I kind of have a two-part question. I would like to hear more about what your experience in Minneapolis was like. And then I would like to know what your congregation here is doing for social justice and the possibility of dealing with ICE.
I'm sorry, the possibility of?
Dealing with ICE.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, my experience in Minneapolis was really profound. I can tell you, well, just when I first arrived on my way to the hotel from the airport, the first thing you notice is the number of cars that are pulled over on the side of the road. So these are cars that have been smashed into because ICE has taken someone and the car has been abandoned. So even just driving from the airport, it was impossible to have the sensation that this is life, at least as I've known it. So some of the things we did as the interfaith clergy group in Minneapolis was join some of the neighborhood patrols. Um, and here's where the positive news is. So on one hand, I was absolutely shocked by what I saw in Minneapolis in terms of really the feeling that the city is under siege by a kind of occupying force. But answering that is the beauty of what the people of Minneapolis are doing to protect their neighbors. I mean, you would not believe how this community is coming together and how really what they're doing is taking care of each other, and how, in spite of all of this pressure from outside, they are refusing to say that some of their neighbors matter less than others. And it's just profoundly, profoundly moving to see that. And I think sometimes when you just look at the news, you know, we live in such a polarized place right now, such a polarized place in the history of our country. I think if you just look at the news, you hear about protesters and demonstrators. What I saw with the folks in the neighborhood, well, even Renee Good and even Alex Preddy, when they were shot, they were not protesting. They were trying to help and protect neighbors who were being targeted. So I'm not even sure if protest is the right word in that, right? I mean, they're simply standing up for the people that they know. The other thing that really struck me about my time there was Minneapolis has an incredibly organized interfaith association, multiple interfaith associations, and multiple interfaith social justice groups. And I think that has a lot to do with the strength that the people have been able to express. They have a real history of working together across difficult things, and they've hung together.
What do you teach or believe about what happens after we pass away?
Oh yeah, that's where you're going to get the biggest diversity, right? That's, if you ask my congregation, you'll get everything from a very kind of traditional understanding of we get reunited with God in heaven, to life is the end of life, to different understandings, some Buddhist understandings of ideas of energies recirculating. So on one hand, there's great diversity, but there are some commonalities, just like we talked about with God. Diversity on one hand, but commonalities on the other. And a core teaching that Unitarian Universalism has is that whatever death is, it's nothing to be frightened of. We have no reason to believe that there would be anything about death that would be painful or a punishment or something to be feared. So I'm actually really glad for this question, because something I like to brag on about Unitarian Universalism is how we've really shaped a lot of ideas about how death happens in America. So to give you a couple examples, garden cemeteries were originally a Unitarian idea. So garden cemeteries are almost all the cemeteries we're used to now. You know, the idea that cemeteries should be beautiful places, places that have some relationship to nature, and maybe even places of art, you know, in terms of monument, but also places for benches, you know, benches where you can sit and quietly contemplate. This whole idea of naturalizing death has been deeply central to Unitarian Universalism. So that would be the core theme, in spite of the huge diversity of different actual beliefs. Some folks do, not everyone.
I was just curious about, does your church tithe? Do you have any stewardship campaigns? How do you pay your bills?
This is the eternal truth across all churches, right? It's an excellent question. How do you do your money? Exactly. So yes, we rely almost entirely on the contributions of our our member families. And so, yes, our stewardship activities would look like the stewardship activities of any Protestant church down the street, right? So once a year, we ask folks how much they would like to pledge for the year. And then we do fundraisers. This Sunday's the chili cook-off. We just did a building renovation. I mean, these things are eternal. One thing I can say about how we organize ourselves that I probably should have said earlier is why we have a denomination, the Unitarian Universalist Association of congregations. We have a congregationalist polity, which means that for us, the congregation is the ultimate political authority over its own affairs, right? So it is the membership of our congregations, the adult membership of our congregations in democratic process that decides what happens to the money. But we collect it the old-fashioned way.
So that's something you and the Southern Baptists have in common, congregation.
Exactly.
I was curious to know if the non-Christian members of your congregation, do they continue to follow the traditions of their faith, say the Jewish or the Islamic faith, or have they altered their faith in some way to be more universal, let's say?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really depends on where the people were when they came to us, right? So some folks who, for example, identify as being Jewish have come to us having kind of already secularized that understanding of themselves and not actively practicing. On the other hand, we do have folks who are still actively practicing. So it is a both and. But I really appreciate your question about do they have to alter their beliefs in order to accommodate themselves in our community. And I would say no if they're coming from a liberal or progressive expression of their home faith. But if they're not, right, it can be a bit of a leap for, as it is for folks coming from Christian denominations too, to come to a place where feeling that the diversity is natural and good.
One thing I've noticed in Unitarian Universalism has a rich commitment to aesthetics and art, music, beauty. I'm wondering if you can say something about that.
No, thank you for observing that. That's absolutely central to our culture. And part of the reason for that is so we are Christian in heritage, but at some point in our history, take you a whole semester to do all the details on that, but at some point in our history, we decided that not only are Christian truths true and valuable and edifying, but there are other truths as well. So it was part of that that made us really come to see that art, literature, poetry are themselves kind of revelations. They're human expressions that teach us very deep things about who we are and who we want to believe. And what we want to believe and what is good for us to believe in common. And so, yeah, art is incredibly significant. A disproportionate number of our folks are usually engaged in arts, music, literature in some way or another. But yeah, the imagination, we are very serious about seeing imagination itself as being a religious and spiritual quality. And that's a piece of the social justice too, right? I mean, if you work for social justice, it has to be because you've imagined a better way. So yeah, imagination is very much at the heart.
How large is your congregation? Do you have mainly seniors? Do you have middle-aged? Do you have a lot of teenagers, children? How does that all break down?
We've got a nice spread of ages, thank gosh. Because that is always the struggle with church communities, right? And after COVID, we had a little bit of a dip in terms of our younger people participating, but I'm so happy to be able to report that now we have a truly multi-generational congregation with everything from older folk to younger families and little babies and all this stuff in between. I think that's the part of church I like the best, right? It's one of the few places in life where we have truly multi-generational relationships. Oh, how many people? Sorry, I didn't hear you. So we have 150 members. We count members as being adults. So that's about 83 families.
You know that for Christians, we have rituals which we call sacraments or ordinances. Are there any rituals that are unique to the Unitarian Universalist tradition?
Just one. I see somebody's right there with me. The chalice. So most of our Unitarian Universalist associations begin worship by lighting the chalice. So the chalice is our symbol, it's our logo. It's actually a relatively new symbol. It was really only adopted 1961, but it had a little bit of a history before that. So the chalice is, have you seen the pictures of the old lamps of truth? You know, so the chalice is kind of a very wide open cup with a flame inside of it. And so where did that come from? It's both a good story and a bad story about where that came from. So it dates to right before World War II, when Unitarians were very active in helping Jewish folks get out of Europe. And part of the way they did that was make up documents for people, very fancy looking documents, so that if officials were trying to detain folks, it would look like this is someone you don't want to mess with. This is someone you need to pass through. But part of the problem with making fancy looking documents is we actually didn't have a logo for Unitarian Universalism. The Unitarians did not have a logo. So actually it was a refugee who overnight drew the chalice as to make up a logo to put it on the documents. So I'm saying it's a bad story, right? Because that's not a really like impressive history for a religious symbol. Like, you know, some dude just kind of drew it one night without thinking about it too hard. That's not a great history. But what I love about that story is I love that we were a people with a set of good deeds that didn't have a symbol, right? How often does religion, you know, get in the predicament of having a bunch of symbols without good deeds to attach to it? But that's how the chalice becomes associated with Unitarian Universalism. And so now, indeed, most congregations open worship with the lighting of the chalice. But I will confess, as a third generation Unitarian Universalist, it really wasn't until 1983, I think, that chalices became very prominent in our worship services. And I was a little scandalized. I was a little scandalized by the new innovation.
Where do you get your training as ministers? Do you have a school that you go to, or do you go to Harvard or Yale or you know?
Oh, Harvard is so ours. Let me tell you that story. Yeah, Harvard actually began as a school for the training of liberal ministers and was for a long time exclusively Unitarian. So we require our ministers to have a Master's of Divinity, and we do have 2 or 3, depending on how you count it, theological schools that are specifically Unitarian Universalists. One of them is Meadville Lombard, which is based in Chicago. There's Starr King, which is based in Berkeley. And Harvard has been a historic affiliation. But we do not require our ministers to go to our schools. So what I do at the Methodist Theological School is help supervise and mentor the UU students who are preparing for UU ministry inside of the Methodist Theological School. Exactly, right. So I think the latest statistic I heard is something like 65% of us train outside of UU schools. I trained at the Methodist Theological School in Ohio. Yeah, and it was a very deliberate choice for me. I felt like as a third generation Unitarian Universalist, I was very solid and informed in my UU identity, but I wanted to know more of the traditional Protestant piece, so it was a good fit for me.
Are there any Christian denominations that you think that the UU finds some closer connections with?
We always get along great with Quakers. I think you can probably understand why. You know, there's the same kind of valuation on individual conscientiousness and the same kind of commitment to justice and equality issues. Also, of course, Quakers kind of share with us a low church appetite, you know, meaning less ritual than rather more ritual. Yeah. And on the genealogical tree of Protestant denominations, you can actually go back and find that Unitarians and Quakers coming from the same side of the Protestant Reformation, from the group that we call Anabaptist, and Anabaptist meaning against baptism, not that they didn't have baptism, but they felt that baptism should be reserved for adults, that religion required your consent, that religion was something you needed to choose as an adult, understanding what you were doing. And so anyway, that whole strand of the Protestant Reformation is we're relatives that way.
Any final questions? Anyone have a question? Anyone else? Anyone else? Is there anything else you'd like to leave us with, Dr. Ritchie? Any thought about UU tradition, history, anything?
Well, I can leave you with a little quote from one of our Unitarian forebears in Transylvania. So this is going to sound very modern, but this is something he said in 1568, and that was, "We need not think alike to love alike."
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Ritchie. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really
Yeah.
appreciate y'all, and excellent questions.
Good. And if you could join us back there, I'm sure people will want to just greet you.